Now, the next speaker is Madame Sarah Vader from the Baha'i International Community. And I think here we have a little bit more knowledge about the Baha'i because the situation of the Baha'i community was subject in many of the resolutions we had. But please.
Thank you very much. We welcome this opportunity to have an open discussion on the situation of religious minorities in Iran. And I think as Barbara mentioned, the European Parliament has made sure that all victims of human rights, including members of religious minorities, are not forgotten, whether it be through resolutions or through statements of various members of the Parliament. And really, we can see that the situation is not improving. And in your introduction, you quoted a number of cases, and there are so many more that could be highlighted. In order to present the situation of the Baha'is in Iran, and you'll find in your documents a 15-page background document with just a very general idea of what their situation is like. I'm going to just present the situation of one Baha'i who is currently in prison and who's been sentenced to 10 years in prison. Fariba Kamalabadi was born in September 1962 in Tehran, and she was a brilliant young girl in school, high school. And when it was time for her to go to university, she was denied access because she was a Baha'i. She married in 1982 a fellow Baha'i, and they have 3 children. After her marriage and after having tried to make a living here and there, she was able to follow the courses offered by the Baha'i Institute for Higher Learning, which is an ad hoc university that was set up by the Baha'i community because Baha'is were denied access to education. And in her 30s, she was able to study psychology, and this is what she was trying to earn a living on after she'd graduated from the Baha'i Institute. Her 3 children, Varha is 24. He left Iran, and he's pursuing a doctoral degree in China. Alhan, 23, actually studied psychology at the Baha'i Institute for Higher Studies in Iran. And Taraneh is 14 years old. Fariba was arrested on 14 May 2008 because she was a member of the ad hoc committee set up to administer the affairs of the Baha'i community. She was held in solitary confinement from May to September, and in September was moved into a cell with the other woman who was serving with her on this ad hoc structure. Now, to just explain a bit of that background, we know that a religious community, according to Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, can set up a structure to administer its affairs. And in most countries, in about 180 countries around the world, the Baha'is have an administration. There's no clergy, but there's an administration. This administration was banned in Iran in the early 80s. The membership of its last National Assembly was actually arrested and killed as a group of 9. And with the knowledge of the Iranians, ad hoc structures were set up at the local and national level to just administer the needs of a community of well over 300,000 people. So she was arrested in May 2008, along with her fellow members of that ad hoc structure. They were in prison from May to, well, they're still in prison, but it's only in February 2009, so over 6 months after they were arrested, that the charges held against them were known, and they were known through a public statement made by the Prosecutor General. The trial started taking place a year later. And during that whole time, the lawyers were not able to have access to the entire files. the prisoners had limited access to their families. And the trial, which was not open for security reason, but for some strange reason, governmental cameras were allowed into the sessions, had a number of sessions in January 2010, in April 2010, and in June 2010. The verdict issued against these 7 people was a verdict of 20 years, which was then reduced to 10 years. And it is not clear what exactly caused the reduction to 10 years, because the lawyers still have not seen a written document with the verdict. And so we can see through this case an illustration of what the Baha'is are facing. We have denial of access to education. One last fact about Fariba. Her experience with the persecution of the Baha'is extends beyond herself. Obviously, her children were not, or 2 of her older children were not given access to university, and so had to find other means. But her father was fired from his job as a physician in the government health service in the 1980s because he was a Baha'i, and he was later imprisoned and tortured. So we can see through this one person, Fariba, denial of access to education for herself and for her family, denial of access to employment for herself, for her father. We can see arbitrary arrests. We can see denial of freedom to organize, worship, and assemble. And so we can, this is why the Baha'i International Community has tried to highlight the fact that these 7 people are a representation of the persecution against the Baha'i community as a whole. Just in terms of numbers, the Baha'i community is composed, or was composed according to statistics that we had in 1979 prior to the revolution. At that stage, it was composed of 300,000 members. Although some members of the Baha'i community have left Iran, a vast majority stayed, and there is every indication to believe that there has been growth, and that the Baha'i community is no doubt much larger today than the 300,000 that it was in 1979. The Iranian Baha'is believe in Iran. They love their homeland, and so even when they are given the opportunity to get passports to leave, they actually want to contribute to the well-being of their nation. And this is what we can see in a lot of the victims of human rights, whether for religious reasons or others. They believe in the greatness of their homeland and want to make it a better place. And the international community can only provide its support in the best way it can, because these people want to stay home. What is the historical and legal reason for this persecution? Well, first of all, the Baha'i religion came into existence after Islam, and so there is for a lot of the clergy, the emergence of an independent religion after Islam is theologically completely incorrect. And furthermore, the progressive ideas of the faith, for example, the fact that without true equality between women and men, the society cannot prosper. So such ideas are of concern to many fundamental Muslim. Following the revolution, there was a sharp increase in the systematic effort of the government to eliminate the Baha'i community as a viable entity in the country. And this systematic program was highlighted in a document uncovered in 1993 by the then UN Special Representative on Iran. He found a document that outlines the policy of the government to deal with the Baha'i question. And this document gives explicit instruction to ensure that, and I quote, the progress and development of the Baha'i community should be blocked. And we can see that some of the details of this policy are clearly still in place today, such as, for example, access of denial to education and employment. Constitutionally, I think, Barbara, you mentioned the fact that some religious minorities are recognized by the Constitution. So Article 13 stipulates that Zoroastrians, Jews, and Christians are the only recognized minorities. So when the Article 14 and 20 of the Constitution claim that all Iranians should have access to all human, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, it is clear, and it has been clear in statement made by authorities, that this refers mainly to, or refers only to, the recognized religious minorities. Now, of course, having said that, we know that the violations are, I mean, they're not very discriminatory when it comes to violating the rights of the general population, and therefore, whether a person is a woman fighting for women's rights or a journalist trying to express his views freely, it doesn't really matter whether they're a member of a religious minority or not. But there has been statement made that clearly indicate that Baha'is are not a recognized religion, and therefore their rights can be ignored. The concerns of the international community were once again highlighted in the resolution on the situation of human rights in Iran, adopted by the General Assembly. And in its preamble paragraph 2G and H, it talks about the rights of minorities, recognized religious minorities. And 2H in particular looks at increased incidence of persecution against recognized religious minorities, particularly members of the Baha'i faith. And I'll just read 2H, and then in your document you'll be able to see details of what these violations entail. So particularly members of the Baha'i faith, including attacks on Baha'is, including in state-sponsored media, increased evidence of efforts by the state to identify, monitor, and arbitrarily detain Baha'is, preventing members of the Baha'i faith from attending university and from sustaining themselves economically, the confiscation, destruction of their property, the vandalizing of their cemeteries, and the sentencing of 7 Baha'i leaders to 10 years imprisonment, despite being repeatedly denied the due process of law that they are constitutionally guaranteed, including the right to timely and adequate access to legal representation of their choice and to a fair and open trial. So in the documents that you have, you'll see that really there are concerns when it comes to denial of the right to organize as a peaceful religious minority. There's denial of the right to live, a denial of the right to liberty and the security of the person, and there have been a number of violent attacks against members of the Baha'i community. They've been arbitrarily arrested and imprisoned. There's denial of access to education, whether it be at the elementary and secondary level, but also then at the higher education level. Confiscation and destruction of the community property, so not just individual property, but also the properties that belonged to the Baha'i community as a whole were confiscated and destroyed. Denial of employment, pension, and other benefits. Some Baha'is have even been asked to pay back the pension that they had received based on the fact that they were Baha'is. Denial of civil rights and liberties, so the fact that Baha'i marriages are not recognized can cause problems when it comes to family law. And as was mentioned by the previous speaker, there is also a systematic incitement to hatred, whether it be in state-owned media or in the training provided to teachers. So we can see that the concerns cover all the areas of life. And just to give you a few numbers in terms of the arrests Currently, there are, you'll see in the numbers, until August 2004, the number of arrests were reduced slightly since the late 80s. The international community's pressure clearly blocked the number of arrests. But since August 2004, there have been 351 Baha'is arrested. Currently, there are 56 Baha'is in prison. 140 Baha'is have been arrested and released on bail and are awaiting trial. So this is some other type of pressure that is put. First of all, bail is very high, and with bail you never know when the trial will happen and what might happen afterwards and what might cause bail to be denied. 19 Baha'is have been arrested and released without bail, so that's not very clear why they were released without bail and what the authorities might decide to do. 19 Baha'is have been tried and sentenced and are free pending appeal or summons to begin serving their sentences. So it's a very worrying situation for human rights in Iran overall. But the fact that victims of human rights know that the international community are discussing their issues is of comfort to them, and we know that it is. They know that they're not left on their own to suffer, but the international community is watching. And also, it's showing the Iranian authorities that they cannot just do whatever they want without impunity, even if they don't necessarily seem to be changing their policy. We know for a fact that when they send a document like the one we've received, or that is there from the Iranian embassy, that says interesting facts, and you can read our view of those facts in the documents that you have. You know that they care and that they're doing their best to counter this pressure. So we welcome the fact that the pressure continues and that we can have an exchange on religious minorities in particular here. Thank you. Thank you. The reason, I would say, behind the recognized, non-recognized is also looking at the religions that come before Islam and the one religion that came after Islam. So that's also a theological reason why the Baha'i faith is probably not recognized, precisely because of this fear that if you recognize something that come afterwards, it undermines your theological foundation. And in fact, there's no justification for this. The Baha'i faith recognizes the value of each religion and respects the followers of all religions, and Baha'is are enjoined to consort and work with followers of all religion in order to build a better society. So the Baha'is are not in for ruling Iran or any world, in any countries of the world, in fact. Now, but the question of what is the perception in Iran of the work that is being done by the international community, we have heard from victims of human rights that have come out that they know that the international community has parliament resolutions that are being voted, General Assembly resolutions that are being voted, statements made by prominent people, whether from governments, non-governmental organizations, academics. And so they know, they feel that their battle is not in vain. And so what can be done more, I think, well, first of all, let's not stop making sure that the international community raises the issue of human rights when it is in contact with Iran. So nuclear is one thing, but whenever nuclear is discussed, let's also say, well, you know, let's also have a discussion on human rights. So the attention should come both in public spaces, but also in private discussions. You know, Barbara, you were mentioning letters that you send to the ambassador here. You know, I think he's not very happy when he receives them, and when these are passed on to the capital, they think, oh, here we go again. You know, we received a letter from the head of the Iran delegation of the European Parliament. When will she stop writing to us, well, do what you have to do, and we'll make sure that we stop writing to you about human rights issues. So I think any opportunity that whether yourself or other members of the European Parliament have to raise the situation of human rights is something that will annoy the authorities, but that will also show the victims of human rights that they're not left alone in their battle to have the fundamental rights of recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for every human being, that these rights are, that they have a right to fight for their freedoms.